Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to another episode of The Ways We Move. We're a little late today because, well, unfortunately, Riverside has had a few problems, but that will not stop us from having this podcast out to you today. My name is Nicolas Zart. I am your host on The Ways We Move, the podcast that highlights innovative mobility solutions and the people behind them. Now, up until now, we've always had, one special guest on the show. Well, this time we're going to have three guests on the podcast, and the reason is very simple. I was meeting with Rex Alexander, with Clint Harper, and Don Berchoff, and all of a sudden it thought it would be a good idea to record what we were going to talk about. So we did talk about the state of advanced air mobility. I want to say a special thank you for everyone for watching this podcast, for making it a success, because in 9 months, we've gone over 600 downloads, which might not be a lot for a lot of podcasts, but for such a niche podcast, it is. And also, thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing. We'd love to hear from you guys. Please don't hesitate. And to let you know that next week we will be in Rome, and we are launching our very first international AAM masterclass. And of course, we'll be recording from out there. But in the meantime, let's hear what Rex, Clint, and Don have to say. Perfect. Well, Rex, why don't you start with an introduction for those out there who might not have heard of Rex?
Who hasn't heard of Rex? I mean, I'm prolific as all get out on social media, and I definitely have an opinion. So, in my world, I live in the vertical flight infrastructure world and have for over 30 years. So, I design heliports for a living, have for 30 plus years. I'm a helicopter pilot by trade, an airframe and power plant technician, airplane pilot, military, commercial ops, offshore oil and gas, spent 20 years in EMS, and have been designing infrastructure, now working in the advanced air mobility ever since I worked for Uber Elevate back in 2017. Run the company now, 5 Alpha. 50% of our business is traditional heliports, and the other 50% is advanced air mobility. I do a lot of R&D with NASA, work with the FAA, ICAO, and all the other alphabet groups out there.
I like that alphabet groups out there. Perfect. Thanks, Rex, for joining us today. Don, tell us a little bit about you. I always learn something new when you talk to us about any weather related technologies out there.
Well, I'm the CEO of True Weather Solutions, started in 2015, really focusing on unlocking the power of science and technology that's been trapped in labs and universities regarding weather. And in 2017, I decided that we needed to get into the drone and eVTOL industry due to the weather sensitivities I knew were coming and the lack of low altitude weather that we have available to us. And I recognized that that was going to become, at some point, it was going to disrupt the industry a little bit economically and from a risk perspective. So my background is a meteorologist by trade. I wanted to be a weather person since I was 7 years old. So this is a life trade for me. And I went off to the Air Force, and I retired as an 06 and ran an Air Force base in Central Asia, Manas Air Base in Central Asia, which was the main staging base in Afghanistan for logistics and cargo and people moving. That's, my blend of weather and aviation and logistics is pretty unique in the weather industry. Very few people have had the pleasure of doing that. And I also was the science and technology director at the National Weather Service for 4 years. So I had about a $130 million budget. I was the one that the upgrade to the national radar system, dual polarization. And I decided to leave the government when I realized the budgets and the ability to get out these new technologies wasn't going to happen fast enough. And so this company is my outlet to doing that. And we're being very successful. We have several test beds now around the country, and we're getting some real traction on demonstrating the value of this data working with operators.
Fantastic. Thanks, Don. And then finally, Clint, tell us a little bit about you. And by the way, all of you have already been on the podcast, so please go and see the previous episodes. But Clint, tell us a little bit more about you, what you're doing, because I know you're doing a heck of a lot too.
Yes, I got a bit of a mixed background, share, a lot of commonalities, with Rex. And on the infrastructure side of the house, I was an airfield manager in the Air Force. And so that's airfield managers. We plan, design, and then operate airports, heliports, and UAV infrastructure. And spent most of my time working with helicopters and other vertical lift aircraft in unconventional operating environments, contingency environments, things of that nature. And retired in 2014. Paired that with an urban planning degree, trying to figure out how to make aviation a better industry, make it more accessible and more meaningful for more people. That got me connected with Rex, Don, and yourself, and many other great people in the advanced air mobility side of that house. Currently working to help give communities a stronger voice, in this industry, helping the industry, I guess, react better and understand better, what the needs of communities are, what the needs and the ailing, issues in the transportation systems are. So we're not a problem that's searching for a solution. There are lots of solutions that exist out there that, are ready for solutions to find them. We just need to talk to the communities, listen, and to be ready to respond in that way. All things on the infrastructure side, airports, a lot of times we see them as one, just big monolithic piece of infrastructure, but in reality, they're a stack of technologies, of both smart technologies and dumb technologies, concrete and weather infrastructure, navigational aids, all that works together to create a safe operating environment for all aircraft, and that's true for the largest, most complex airports in the world, all the way down to, the most simplistic heliports in the world. There's still, different stacks and layered bits of technology. And so taking, what I've learned from that and scaling that, in different ways to understand how to respond to, the different things that are emerging within the advanced air mobility sector, from, STOL aircraft to electric vertical takeoff and landing to UAS and drone ports. We're, trying to take the lessons that we've learned, in the, in all my life and experience in the military, and figure out how we can best leverage that so that we're not having to repeat mistakes or make unnecessary hard lessons learned, as we lean into the future.
Yeah, well, that's very well said, and you guys are all pretty much the backbone of advanced air mobility. I know that I always rely on the three of you and a few other people when I want to just double check on what I'm thinking of what I've heard or something like that. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about, speaking of these companies launching themselves in advanced air mobility, or those have been around for a long time. Obviously, for the last 8 months, this is 2025. For the last 8 months, there have been a lot of changes. There have been a lot of movement. And also, what I notice more and more is there are a lot of companies who don't talk nearly as much. And we still see the press releases, the very enthusiastic press releases, but there's a lot of reshuffling of resources and even budgets, which is affecting us one way or the other. So I wanted to kind of open it up to the three of you to tell me a little bit about what you're seeing out there. And I'm coming from the point of view that I see a lot of companies sort of not talking anymore. I see even the FAA being very careful in what it says and everything, rightfully so. So I kind of wanted to gauge your point of view, and of course, I've got something behind my head we'll get to at one point. So, anybody who wants to take it away, go for it.
Yeah, I'll jump in there and
Come
just
on,
get the
Rex.
conversation started.
I knew
Nah.
I was expecting Rex to go first. I was like,
I think we're kind of just waiting on somebody to go first, but yeah, the awkward pause kind of forced me into
yeah.
it.
First, each of us, and we just have so much respect for
I'll let Clint kick that one off first.
Okay. Yeah, how I've always, looked at this, like certifying a new, kind of aircraft is very difficult, and we've seen that, from the introduction of this new industry with the Uber white paper on urban air mobility, what vision that communicated. Initially it was talking about, a vision of having certified aircraft in 2020, and as we've been grappling with the realities of how challenging it is to certify new technology. And again, an aircraft also is a stack of technologies, and each component of those technologies, have to be certified, have to be tested. It's very challenging, it's very costly. And as we're grappling with those realities, those timelines are continuing to shift to the right. And as we're getting closer to the realities of real flights, for credit flights towards certification, I think a lot of the resources that once were expended on, much to my chagrin, on community engagement, working on the infrastructure side of the house, a lot of those resources are being funneled and reprioritized into getting the aircraft across those finish lines. Because, we can talk about vertiports and infrastructure all day long, but if there's no demand because there's no aircraft to use that infrastructure, then what are we even here for? And so I can kind of understand, even though I don't like it all the time, that we don't have as much focus on infrastructure and communities and things of that nature. We do need that aircraft to really do anything.
Yeah, it's true that on both side of the aisles, whether you're on the vehicle side of things or on the infrastructure side of thing, we all think we're the most important part of it, but really we're working together. So that's a good point to be made.
I
Rex, I
think
know you're dying to.
Well, I was gonna say, Clint, I think you nailed it. Man, as always, I think heads are down. What's interesting though, I'd love to hear Rex or Clint talk about this pre-certification we're hearing, some of these groups out of the UAE and how, there might be some stipulations. I find that interesting. I actually had a conversation with somebody. I'm at the commercial UAV and it's not usually AAM focused, but there was somebody here that I met that talked about that, looking at how it's an operator. So it was interesting. But I think what the good news is, I think for all of us, those who are ready as a, whatever you want to call us, an automated data service supplier, because that's what's in the NPRMS, the notice for public rulemaking. Anybody who's ready, I think some of the word I'm hearing is once they really want to start going and they want to scale, those companies that are really in a position to step in and provide those surrounding services are going to be well sought after because they know that this is something that is going to be critical. Of course, initially they're going to just try to get through it just to get some, like a helicopter operation, right, Rex? And I'm sure you could talk about that a little bit, and we could talk about the strengths and weaknesses of that approach. But so I think that's what you're going to see. But you're right about the community engagement, Clint. That's something that takes much longer time to lay the groundwork for, and so they could be running into some of those cases where they're not going to have a happy constituency around that area. So I thought you great points.
Now, Nicholas, you talk about people being quieter on the infrastructure side. I've seen that to some degree. I've also seen a lot of people doing work behind the scenes. Now, there are a good number of groups and individuals out there doing a good job and paying attention to the details. For every one group or individual that is doing that, there are two that are absolute idiots in this space. And some of
Hmm.
the stuff that we see come across
Hmm.
the internet is kind of like, that's not a good idea on a bad day. So I think in the space of developing infrastructure, developing a totally economically viable AAM system, the business model is going to prove itself out. Goal in developing infrastructure is making sure while it's doing that, it's doing so in a safe way. And one of the things that Clint and Don and I have all had these conversations, and Nicholas, I know you and I have had the conversation, is okay, what are the standards we need to meet? And we're still working those out. And we see stuff come across the internet every day. And it's like, it doesn't meet any standard ever written by anybody. And it's like, what were you guys thinking? So in a case like that, I've gotten a little bit more jaded, a little harder. I'm starting to call people out a little bit harder when I see stupid stuff, or as Clint and I like to say, novel.
Cat's out of the bag.
With that being said, there are people out there that are really advancing advanced air mobility infrastructure in the right direction. It'll be interesting to see. You asked a little bit about what the FAA is doing. They're being really quiet. I had conversations
Yeah.
with them. They're working on the next iteration of standards. So they're going to take the Heliport Design Advisory Circular 2 Delta and merge that with the Engineering Brief 105 Alpha and publish a vertical flight infrastructure standard. Once that's published, those other two documents will be sunsetted. They're also going to put stall port information in that new standard as
Oh.
well. So that's going to make a huge change. So they're in the development stage. Expectations is probably spring of 2026, we'll see something released for comment, public input, probably, if I was a betting man, by the end of 2026, beginning of 2027, you'll see that new standard come out. So the FAA is working. They're working behind the scenes quietly. They have had a lot of conversations with a lot of the OEMs. So we're seeing some progress there. It's just they're keeping their cards very close to the vest.
Yeah,
Clint,
and it's true that they.
let me just say, Rex, if I see windsock as a standard in there, I'm just gonna go to the moon.
Well, there's no wind on the moon.
working on it, man. I'm working on it. Yeah.
Boy, talk
Hey,
about a
Clint,
slippery
show some of
slope.
those windsock pictures you send me all the time. The ones that are just a ring.
Yeah,
There's
the
nothing.
frame, no sock.
Yeah,
You got two pointing two different directions and
that's
same location. Those are always
Thank
good.
It's the Dyson ring. It's a new thing Dyson invented. Sorry.
Yeah. Visually unobtrusive.
Yeah, yeah. And it's good for birds too. It doesn't kill them, right? That's good. I wanted to continue a little bit in that direction before we go back to something that you said, Don. There's a lot of talk also of reauthorizing the FAA, giving it the right amount of money. ATC, of course, has been in the light line. A lot of incidents and accidents these days when it comes to Part 135 aviation. How do you think all of this is affecting advanced air mobility? Because the one thing I'm kind of afraid of is people thinking, oh, I don't want to fly these days, let alone on an electric aircraft. What's your take on that?
I'll let Clint or Rex take it.
Yeah,
first.
Rex, that was you, because I wanted to piggyback on what you were saying with the
Okay.
FAA.
So in that discussion, I would say one of the key elements when we're designing infrastructure is designing it safely. One of the things we look at and pay attention to is trying to learn lessons from history. So when we look at accidents that have occurred, we make sure that we don't repeat those accidents. The FAA has pretty good take on that, in that they send all of their FAA inspectors now through the heliport evaluation course that the Transportation Safety Institute puts on in Oklahoma City. I am a platform instructor and help teach that course. Then they have other courses for accident investigation, one of which is the Advanced Helicopter Accident Investigation course, where I teach 4-hour block of instruction on how to investigate accidents that occur at infrastructure, whether it be at a heliport, an airport, on a ship, on an offshore platform. In that, we go through a lot of the accidents and dissect them. The challenge or the problem we've always had is that when the accident investigation is finished, the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, has never been through that course. And they always blame the pilot. It's pilot error, pilot fault. Pilot didn't keep distance from this. Pilot didn't take into account that. Honestly, the NTSB has gotten it wrong so many times, it's not even funny, because they don't pay attention to the causal factors at infrastructure level. And it's never written up in the final report or even taken into account, and a lot of times in the docket material. So we have seen a change where the NTSB is now starting to send their people through the accident course as well as the heliport course. However, it's be a very slow change. So when we look at the accidents, there's repetitiveness that we have to grab a hold of and stop before we get into the advanced air mobility, because we see the same accidents occur over and over and over because we've never learned from our lessons, primarily because we've never written those lessons down.
So I want to piggyback on that.
It's funny
real
because
quick,
you
if I
hear the
can.
NTSB. I wanted to jump to you because I saw you waving, but it's interesting because the NTSB says exactly the same thing, that we have to learn from our past experiences. I just never knew they weren't part of all the trainings that you guys were doing. Makes no sense to me.
No, that's one of the things when we did the research study for the Vertical Flight Society paper that we published on accident investigation through a 50-year period. I would say out of the 185 accidents that we reviewed that fit the scope and the range of the accidents we were looking for, there were probably 3 that the NTSB actually pointed to the infrastructure being a factor. In almost every other case, it was always the pilot's fault, which, if you build a pilot trap and it works, don't be surprised.
Yeah. Clint, what's your take on that? I see you shaking your head.
A betting man at that time, when 1990 hit, chap. Well, when it comes time for
Step pathway. So I had the privilege and honor, during my time in the Air Force of being the instructor supervisor of all 4 of the DoD's infrastructure courses, for airfields, heliports, and UAV infrastructure. And, we did embellish this in the classroom a little bit, but it is true to an extent to where, it's almost flipped in the military, to where, because in the Air Force, pilots run the world.
in between that probably would have stopped.
So it's very rare that automatically it's just defaulted to pilot error. They're the first ones that usually get absolved, from blame on that. when we taught this in the courses, we usually followed it, very, kind of tongue in cheek, but we followed a simple pathway to show how important it was for us to have our T's crossed and our I's dotted, saying that, pilots are the first ones to get absolved. They push it off onto ATC. ATC, in the Air Force or in any military branch are still FAA certified controllers, so they have very robust processes and procedures that they abide by. They still go by the FAA order 7110.65. So they're typically absolved pretty quickly of any wrongdoing. And so that comes down to the infrastructure. And again, the infrastructure, we take many cues from the FAA and ICAO, but we're not certified. We're not licensed, similar to, we have a Part 139 inspired process, but it is not Part 139. So we're left to our own devices on how we protect ourselves, and paper chain and what paper trails we have to protect ourselves. How do we prove that we did our thing, our jobs right? And so the one thing that I always talk about is I've been on the end of a runway many, many times, where we've had an in-flight emergency or we have an aircraft that has, taken some damage or has an issue. And I'm going through my mental checklist in my head. Did I do everything right on my shift to make sure that this aircraft, when it hits the ground, is going to have the maximum chance of survival, because the infrastructure has been maintained in the best way that it can. And if it's not, if things have been ignored or deferred, down the road, do I have the paper trails to show that I've been pushing the needle on that to make sure that, we've been doing everything we can, and it's other things that have been preventing those things from being done. And so it's a very opposite environment. And so when I transitioned from the military over to the civilian side, I was shocked, when I saw what Rex was talking about to be the reality, to where it's just automatically defaulted over to pilot error. And for maybe a split second, I was like, oh, well, it must be nice on this side, because now we don't have to worry about all the stuff that we did. But then I saw, the realities, of how poorly the infrastructure is managed in certain cases, and saw the huge opportunity for improvement that could be done with the heliports and even the airports. And then as we're talking about new infrastructure, new emerging infrastructure, such as drone ports, how do we make sure that we get this right out the gate, so we're not repeating these same mistakes? And I always talk about, and Rex talks about it as well, that the foundation that we have today is a foundation that we're iterating and evolving upon for all the future infrastructure. And if we don't have a strong foundation today, which arguably there are parts where we don't, then we need to shore that up so that we have that strong foundation, so when we develop vertiports, STOL ports, drone ports, that's being developed, in those initial early steps very strongly, because that foundation is strong.
That's really interesting what you're saying, because it always seems to me, at least, that infrastructure is a bit of a hindsight kind of thing. Everybody wishes the pretty vehicles and everything. We went through the same thing with EV adoption, by the way, until we had a standards charging war that delayed it by 2 to 3 years. And I never understood why infrastructure is more prevalent. It should be included in all the talks and everything. Don, I wanted to get your point of view there, because you also have similar experiences and background, and especially when it comes down to weather predictions and data and everything, you guys have the same kind of problems, don't you?
Windsock. So you know, it just amazes me that we're using an 50s technology at these heliports, you know, which has so many problems and adds so much more risk to so many things, but yet because we have had it and because it's legacy, it must be okay. And I see that across all of aviation weather. I started getting involved in this, the first thing was people would say to me, why are you trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist? We've been flying with the weather system we've had for years. And I like to remind folks that weather is a safety and an economics issue. And so, for me, when I think about infrastructure, and I've tried to craft my pitch on this, because I can't break the legacy thinking about it, because the pilots take pride in being able to land in 200 foot and a quarter, even though they're supposed to be VFR. I try to explain that, just because we've been doing it this way doesn't make it right. And the fact that, if you look, and I know Rex could talk this a lot better than me, especially in GA, I'll talk about GA. If you look at the accident investigations, and I'm going to be loose with the stats here. So I know, Rex, you're going to help me out if I speed too much. It's like 75% of GA accidents are weather is a contributing cause, and only 16%, and I'm talking about for fatalities, and only 16% of the root cause. But you look at that number, if you think about, I mean, I'm looking at what happened out in California recently, where the GA was landing. They didn't get a NOTAM about the weather system being out at the airport when they were on their way cross country. If they had, I don't know the details about how they got their last bit of weather data, but they still decided to approach in marginal weather, probably IFR. And then they had an accident. And the question, I ask is how does something like that happen? So in that case, it's a combination. If the NOTAM didn't have the information about the weather station being out, then it's hard to blame the pilot. If the NOTAM did say the weather station was out, then why did they proceed? Well, they proceeded because, you just try to get in, and then if you can't, you divert, right? Because you don't want to be inconvenienced because you're coming back on a trip with your family. And so I get so frustrated because the weather piece is so underappreciated, but yet it's one of the most contributing causes of accidents. So my focus is making sure we don't have the windsock be the standard at a future vertiport, because it's bad for a number of reasons. Number one, it's not digital. And so, even if you believe that if I could see the windsock, I know what the winds are doing at the vertiport, I can land properly. It still doesn't mean that, because as Rex said, you can have wind swirling. And I could show you a simulation this morning. We're running simulations right now every hour in a 2x2 kilometer area around Alliance Airport under a DOT SMART grant. And it's amazing when I show people that simulation and I say, this is really what's happening. They don't believe it. And I say, well, you better believe it, because winds don't behave like you think they would in an airport. So your METAR is totally useless now, depending on where you are and what you're doing. The NPRMS, which I'm very pleased with, and I know this doesn't really touch on AAM yet, but it will, because it's going to evolve and it's going to be the same, talks about, we finally got something in writing that says that if you get 5 miles from a METAR, it's basically that you can't depend on the data. And it's actually saying that for BV loss operations, and this applies to helicopters and GA, and it's going to apply to AAM and electric vehicles. Basically says that, we may be going to third-party weather to fill those gaps. And that's the first time in history that the door has been open. And I give the FAA a lot of credit for that. And so what we've got to do now is take advantage of that, because they're giving us the option now to do a better job on infrastructure, both along corridors and at the vertiports or the drone ports. And we can increase the efficiency and the number of flights flown, because you won't be canceling when you can fly now. You'll have more data on your battery power management. And this is where I was getting to is, infrastructure along corridors for weather and at the vertiport are going to be absolutely key to knowing what the winds are actually doing. Because I can give you 20% of the time, the winds on our model at 80 meters are off 5 to 10 knots. Every day I see one, because I have these vertical LiDARs now out around the country, and I show people the real thing. And that doesn't seem like a lot, but it is a lot if you're trying to count, hertz, or whatever we're trying to power. And right now they're going to have to carry a certain amount of power reserve on batteries that, these aircraft land as heavy as they take off, which is different than traditional aviation, which means you need more power. And they're going to have the ability to get to an alternate. And if you don't have good wind, you're going to put yourself out of the game many more times, or you're going to carry less weight, or you're going to not be able to travel as far. And this is a major factor for this whole industry. Infrastructure for weather is going to have to be viewed just as important as other infrastructure around the airspace. And to end it, spacing of aircraft coming into a vertiport, initially, you may only have one flight a day. Okay, fine. You don't need all that, right? Except, and if you have time and luxury of time, and your client doesn't care if they get to the airport on time, you don't need to worry about it, right? But as soon as you start getting to scheduled services, as soon as you want to land 8 an hour, As soon as you have this happening in areas where winds are changing due to Ventura effects, and maybe not in the actual downtown, because I don't think we'll see. I mean, Rex and Clint talk about this more. I think initially you're going to see a lot of these vertiports on the peripheries along the rivers or along the, but the bottom line is the winds blow through the urban canyon out to those areas. And those turbulence and that wind swirliness actually could propagate miles. So this is going to become much more critical. And I guess, I'm trying not, this is my bandwagon, right? But I think it's going to be really important. I think hopefully, I think we're starting to see progress. People are understanding it. And the key is to get into the planning cycle early, just like with Clint, his community engagement. You can't wait. Weather infrastructure could be budget dust. And I'm talking about good weather infrastructure. I'm talking about a wind LiDAR. I'm talking about a salometer. And then we got to deal with the downdrafts and outwash, right? Downwash and outwash, which Rex has been really studying heavily. And that's going to change based on environmental conditions and other things. We just got to get the right infrastructure at these places. If we do, you can have much smoother operations. You're going to get more aircraft in and out. You're going to have more weight carried because you'll have more predictability and reliability in the wind and certainty. And that's the future I see.
It's interesting, and you're right. That's a very good point to be made. Clint, Rex, what's your thought on all that?
Now, I would say that Don, brings up fantastic points, and the infrastructure in conjunction with the weather data and the weather infrastructure go hand in hand to provide what we're really looking to give to the public, and that is the smoothest ride possible and the safest ride possible. So when we design the infrastructure, we look to make sure that we're shooting the approaches and departures into the wind as much as possible, because we know if we're not, there's a degradation in the aerodynamic proficiency of the airframe, number one, and also creates a very rough ride if you're trying to do downwind operations. So having the data to be able to then design the infrastructure around is one of the key factors. When we look at what Don had talked about for the weather, when we look at accident rates, I can point to the air medical industry as a whole and say that the number one cause of accidents in the air medical industry has been weather. There's always been a huge push in fixing that, still more to do. But one of the challenges we run into is getting good weather data in the cockpit. So when the pilot takes off, a lot of times the data that they're basing their decisions on is something they read before they took off. Do they have access to the good data en route? And we do risk analysis prior to taking off. So we'll do a full risk analysis, take off, and it's a very static risk analysis. In a perfect world, in Don's world, that risk analysis is being constantly recomputed throughout the entire flight based on new information every minute, so that when something changes, either good or bad, it alerts the pilot and says, hey, your risk is just increased or decreased based on X. That's where we want to get to. And I think, as Don said, yeah, the windsocks, they're a good thing. They're a great standard to have, but we need to augment that with new technology.
Yeah. Yeah. And Don brings up a great point that I've learned from him, when he first started talking, he talked about it's a safety issue and an economics issue. Yeah. And, being on the infrastructure side and coming from the Air Force, it's always a safety issue, and I've always, really foot stomped on that. And unfortunately, I can see where people get tired of hearing, the safety plugs and the safety warnings and all that. You get accused of being a fear monger and all that kind of stuff by the industry because, they don't want to, hear this kind of stuff. They're afraid that it's going to, turn communities against them and things of that nature. And that's never the intent. We're trying to create a safe and sustainable system. It wasn't until working with Don until I heard, the economics issue. And that's a really important piece on that. And I dug into that a little bit and learned, how different weather services are accessed, depending on the economics and at play and the risk, in, losing, I guess, a portion of the economic slice of the pie on that. And I've kind of, when I talk to certain folks and they kind of, to help them understand, why, there is a precedent for people paying, for privatized weather, data. There's a certain level of pilots, the private hobby pilots, recreation pilots, where they'll just go and check, AOPA or their ForeFlight and look at the weather forecast, and that's good enough for them. If it looks bad, if it doesn't pass the check, they're okay. It doesn't, flying that day isn't a big enough deal for them to really push the envelope. And so they're okay to either cancel or go ahead, with that decision. Maybe they're flying their family, or some family friends. there's a little bit more risk involved. They want to be a little bit more risk adverse because of that. So they're going to take it one step further, and they're going to call 1-800 weather brief and get a briefing from an actual, dispatcher, on what the weather's doing along their route, and, get more information fed into their decision-making processes. And now, that's one more, step along the chain. Now you get into part 135, operators, and I'm sure, Rex can speak to this as well. You got, subscription services, where you can get access to, weather dispatchers, weather meteorologists, and those kind of folks, who are on demand, to provide you with customized weather briefings and things of that nature. So you have that available to you, and you're paying for those kind of services because, you don't want to risk, losing that kind of money. And then you get into the part 121 where you're flying, giant tubes full of 200 people, across oceans and things of that nature, very, very risk adverse. And so for that reason, you're paying to have meteorologists on staff, in a room with your dispatchers that have a constant, line of communication to your pilots that are given live information dynamically, through the whole duration of that flight. And all that is to, reduce the risk of, not just a safety incident from happening, but also of, the economics, side of the house taking a hit on that. And so that precedent is already there. I think it's just, we just haven't grappled with that yet because there's not enough scale on the AAM side of the house or on the UAS side of the house. And I think once we start getting and seeing that scale manifesting, we're going to start seeing those services become, more realistic, and everybody's going to look back and say, "Oh, Donald tried the whole time," because that's that's the way it's done today. And I think looking into the crystal ball isn't hard. People always use that analogy. I'm going to look into the crystal ball, the magic 8 ball. I know you have one back there usually. Um, but we can is not difficult to do that because we've done this. We've been here before. We've learned lessons again, through all this stuff. We can talk about how we've been through these growing pains already. And these are the things that have emerged to deal with those growing pains. And we already have these services. Don's just improving on what's already been out there, adding more information, more data to what exists, improving those forecasts, getting them more granular, and making them, available in the same way that, they've been available all the time out there, either through, 1-800 weather brief. I know, there's processes where the folks that, those folks can access the sensors that Don's deploying, all the way to the on-call subscription meteorologist, to eventually, I'm sure, the folks, providing weather on the ground. And that also, because I'm not, 100% an economics guy, I'm going to come back and continue to foot stomp the safety case. Back in 2024 at the Verticon, and I think that's when they rebranded it Verticon in 2024. We had the infrastructure day where the FAA, was able to still be with us and provide briefings. They talked about the top three. Well, they actually gave a slide of all the rotorcraft incidences, but the top three are loss of control in flight, struck object during low altitude operations, and the number three cause of accidents was unintended flight into IMC. And so if we take those top three causes of accidents, with rotorcraft, and look at what's happening within AM and UAS, and I don't like separating those two because I consider them all part of the same umbrella. There's risks and the potential of us, following or repeating some of the same mistakes. And we can kind of pull some of this out from the NPRM right now for part 108 and see how there's risks, shielded object or shielded routes, following lines or power lines or pipelines or things of that nature. I think that, someone in the rotorcraft industry could say we're setting ourselves up to repeat the mistake of striking objects during low altitude operations. Because if I was setting up a special use airspace corridor in the military, the first thing that we would do in doing that would be doing a survey, so we can identify all the objects that might exist out there, so we can make sure that those are charted and the pilots are aware of that. We're not doing that right now for shielded operations for UAS. Loss of control in flight. What would be the number one cause of that with UAS and the NPRM? Well, lack of C2. We got to have a C2 link, to control those aircraft. And then, of course, the unintended flight in IMC or unintended flight into IMC conditions. If we don't have meteorology sensors out there reporting what that looks like in low altitude ops, then how are we going to know where the IMC conditions exist? And so those are the top three that exist today. One can make an argument that we're setting ourselves up for that to be the top three going into the future with UAS and AM.
So what I'm hearing you guys say, and wait for it because it's an aha moment for probably a lot of people, but if we actually do our research well, we take into consideration everything that's happened, and especially looking at how for the past 30, 40 years, disruptive technologies have come in, we are going to save money today and create a much safer day tomorrow. Is that what you guys are saying? Really? Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things, building a footprint that we can replicate takes advantage of the mistakes we've made in the past. I know Don had talked about several pieces on the infrastructure when it comes to weather, and have done a lot of work with folks out in Boulder National Center of Atmospheric Research. And I equated it to, and Donald like this, I said, weather has a shelf life, and each type of weather has a different shelf life. I said, temperature is kind of like a can of Spam. It'll sit on the shelf forever. Weather, ceilings and visibility is like a freshly baked loaf of bread without preservatives. I said, winds and turbulence has a shelf life of gas station sushi or slightly there less. So when you look at data, and weather data particularly, how old is it? And every type of data has a different shelf life. And like I said, winds and turbulence are changing second by second.
I have to now use that, of course. Now I'm gonna have to, although I probably would shorten some of it a little bit, but in the shelf life. But the thing I want to add here, though, and I think this is important, because I don't think the average even pilot understands this, but I would say definitely people in this industry that are supporting this industry. We do not measure weather below 5,000 feet at any place but the airports. Now, we do have weather radar, but let's keep in mind weather radar is precipitation only. You don't see the clouds, you don't see the visibility, you can't see the wind if it's precipitating, but you don't see the wind if it's not precipitating. And so the bottom line is the last time we upgraded our low altitude weather infrastructure in the United States was in 1992, and that was the Doppler weather radar. And since then, we've been operating with the same weather systems. Now, satellites have, they have a usefulness, big usefulness, but they degrade when you get below 5,000 feet to single strength. So what we've seen is an amazing improvement in longer range forecasting and in forecasting of larger systems, like regional level systems like snowstorms and things like that, because of satellites purely, and they're amazing. But when it gets to micro weather, we haven't really effectively improved the data going into our models. Our models have gotten better and faster, but they're using the same inputs. And there's only so much you can squeeze from that lemon. And we've squeezed everything out. And so when people talk about machine learning in weather, when they talk about low altitude, they really don't have data. They don't have real historical data set except at an airport. And between airports, we do not measure the weather. So ceiling, visibility, wind, turbulence, a lot of it's dependent on terrain. It's dependent on water sources. It's dependent on inversions. It's dependent on all these things that we don't pick up in a lot of places. So the models do the best they can in taking this limited data set. We take what's up here, we take these little spikes here, and we go, if this is doing this up here and it's doing this here, it's probably doing something like this in here. But that's why you get surprised. So the weather is unknowable right now between METAR sites. And especially as you move into drones, by removing the pilot, you've removed the best weather sense you've ever had, and you're removing all heuristics that pilot has learned. Like when Rex was flying helicopters in South Korea, hopefully just South Korea. When he used to fly those, he would come into the weather shop, and a guy like me, probably a lieutenant, would look at him and go, "Hey, everything looks good today, right?" And then he goes, "I flew in this route on this type of day for 100 times. And I know when I get on the other side of that ridge, I'm going to have turbulence. Or I know when I get into that valley at this time of the morning, there's going to be fog." Now, if I'm lucky enough and I have a good relationship with Rex, he'll tell me when he comes back that there was fog in the valley. And then we pick up some of Rex's heuristics, right? But that's what Rex is doing. That's why they call us weather liars, right? Because we tell them to their face they're not going to see the fog. He knows I'm going to see the fog today. But once you take them out of the cockpit and you're not flying those routes, and they're remotely piloting vehicles thousands of miles away, they have no way of being any better than what we have. And that's why we have to backfill this digital infrastructure. And it's only because of the weather sensitivities and the electrification of vehicles, right? because you can't put more power on them. And so you're kind of stuck, right, in this conserved system. Economics does drive risk, by the way. And I know you know this, Rex and Clint. If you have a business model that you have to prove to your investors that's already working on the margins, and we know what I'm talking about, because you don't have, you all pay for your airline ticket and you're paying for weather. You're paying $70, you're paying probably 30%. The weather tax is probably on your ticket, because they already know that they've got to account for all those things that are going to happen that weather uncertainty causes. And they're not going to lose money because of that. They're going to
Especially
charge you
flying in
for it.
DFW.
You can't. That's right. So the bottom line is that price either is going to get paid by the client on those aircraft that are coming, the eVTOLs or the drones, or they're going to have to get better weather data that doesn't exist today in order to reduce that uncertainty and know they could fly. And if they can't fly and they're getting pressure from their CFO, yeah, the most professional person in the world, you would think, would say, no, I'm not doing it. But what happened to Kobe Bryant?
Yeah, bingo.
Yeah,
Bingo.
pressure to fly has always been one of the key accident causational factors, both internal and
Number
external
5
pressure.
on the most common rotorcraft accidents cause of rotorcraft accidents is controlled flight into terrain.
Mm-hmm.
Boom.
That's right.
Well,
I mean, look, we've all been around, like Rex and I and Clint. This is a lot of experience that's seen a lot of things. We know how humans behave. Sometimes that doesn't get into the equation. Rex knows more than anybody, because he's been on he's been on these accident investigation boards. I've been on one, I think. And it wasn't that the same type where you had to look at the human factors piece as much, but it's there. It's a real entity.
yeah, I wanted to thank you all for being here today. So we're coming up on the last few minutes of this, and always a lot of interesting, important things that you guys are bringing to the table. Like you said, Don, also a lot of experience, 30 plus years, all of you guys together. I guess the last question, and if we can talk about it in about 5 minutes or so, is do you think we're going in the right, and I know this is a can of worms I'm opening here, but do you think we're going in the right direction when it comes to advanced air mobility? Understanding everything we've talked about right now, are we ready really within 5 years to have these electric aircraft fly? Will it take longer? Will it take less? Are we somewhat going in the right direction? And I know it's a very loosey-goosey kind of question, but I think it's important for people to also understand what is going on, what needs to be worked on, and everything. If anybody want to take that one, go ahead.
I think there's a couple things that we need to see done in the interim before we start seeing advanced air mobility transportation. Now, I'm going to plug for our friends down in Florida. They actually put a new legislation in place that provides the state Department of Transportation with more oversight in the vertical lift environment. So in the past, the FAA doesn't have any legislative or oversight authority when it comes to vertical flight infrastructure that's private use. 99% of all heliports in the U.S. are private use. There's only 53 public use heliports. Florida passed a state bill that said that basically giving a third category. So you have public, private. They now have private with public interest, which is basically, it's private use. However, you're doing commercial operations there. So it gives the state DOT the authority to say, no, you're not meeting the standard, fix this. The other piece of the puzzle is something that we've been talking about, and Clint and I have talked about this in the past, and I've given a few presentations on it, is current vertical flight infrastructure, i.e. heliports, is exempt from Part 139. Well, 139 is certification standards for airports, and that's the one place we find safety management system requirements for infrastructure. At the present time, infrastructure at the vertical flight side is totally exempt from having an SMS. So I think in that case, that is a huge proponent for safety that we're not using. So those are the two areas I would say states and municipalities need to start getting involved like Florida just did. And then from the overarching umbrella, safety management systems need to be employed.
Yeah, well said, Rex. That's a very. I know that's the one thing that you two taught me a few years ago. There was no real certification on the infrastructure side of thing. Considering all the certification requirements that are for vehicles, it seems that that would be something that should happen. Clint, what are your thoughts there?
You 100% agree with Rex. Like he says, we talk about this often. And, to give you an example, one of the things that I hear a lot, from proponents of advanced air mobility and saying, why we should try and advance and move this forward a little bit quicker is the safety record of aviation. And in response to that, and I agree, we do have, a great safety record, but we also have to recognize that when we talk about aviation's stellar safety record, more often we're talking about Part 121 scheduled airline services. That's the highest safety record. That's where we typically celebrate that most success. When we get to Part 135 or Part 91, that safety record isn't as glorious as the Part 121 operations. And then we can come back and look at the infrastructure on that. And we got a neat little lineup of how we line up infrastructure, airspace, aircraft operations, when we're looking at Part 121, so we got a Part 25 certified transport aircraft that's operating under Part 121, scheduled airline operations. It's landing at a Part 139 certified airport, operating within Part 71 and Part 77 designated airspace. All that comes together and harmonizes, to make for that really stellar safety record. But we don't have that. That breaks down when we get to rotorcraft. We used to have Part 127, for transport helicopters, that was kind of the equivalent of Part 121. But that, went away when, the whole helicopter airlines really didn't work out back in the 70s, and so we have some gaps. And there's just a lot, we could probably spend a whole nother hour, on talking about, the gaps that exist within that. And Rex, kind of filled that gap right there, saying that the states and some of the local, municipalities probably need to, take a bigger role in that and looking at their codes and ordinances that they have on the books and understanding their roles on the infrastructure space, because that's really where they have the most jurisdictional authority is on the infrastructure piece. And so they can go a long way in understanding, what can be done to make sure that they're doing, their part in ensuring safe infrastructure with all this.
Wow, indeed, indeed. Any last words?
You're asking a weather guesser what the future will look like for advanced air mobility. I don't think I'm in Vegas, but I don't think I'd put money on my answer. But here's what I would tell you is that I think, it's gonna happen. It just may not look exactly how we all think it's gonna happen,
Yep. Yes.
and it's like running a small business. I started a business and I, things have happened kind of the way I thought they would happen, but there's been a lot of twists and turns in the road. And, whether or not it's going to get widespread adoption where you're going to have middle class taking advantage of AAM, I don't know, right? Is it going to be the Jetsons, or is it going to be still the trips out to the Hamptons? I don't know. Is it going to happen, battery power technology, how is that going to be able to move along at a rate that's going to be required for the business model to get better and better, right? And turn this into, something that's going to be profitable for people. And the adoption by the public of it, which Clint talked about, but it's also the question of how many people would fly on these vehicles. I ran into somebody yesterday. Again, I picked up a useful bit of information. I really respect her a lot, so I'm assuming it's true. But when you do she runs business jets, and she said that when there's been surveys done that say only 10% of business jet clients would fly on a helicopter, right? And because of their, safety fears or whatever, and they may not be justified, but you get what I'm saying. It doesn't matter. We have a lot of fears in society that aren't justified, and then we have a lot of fears that are not happening in society that we should be worried about. So, when it gets to humans, you just never know how they're going to respond. But I think those are the questions, that are still lurking. But I think there's enough money being poured into it that there will be an advanced air mobility industry. It's just, what's it going to look like?
Yeah, that's well said. And I think you're right. I mean, we do have a lot of pieces to put together, and like we often say on this show, the book is being written as we go along. And that's why sometimes it feels like we're moving so slow. Then we look back, we're moving forward, but there are still pieces that need to come together. And again, watching what happened in history, if not, we're doomed to repeat it over and over again. Gentlemen, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's an easy one, right? Low hanging fruit right there.
Never seen anybody learn from history.
Yes, The octopus shed its shell because it learns from history. That's an interesting thing. I just found out. I was like, oh, I didn't know that. Thank you. So, but it does happen. Maybe not with humans, but it does happen with the rest of those so-called animals. So anyway, thank you all for coming today. That was really interesting to see everything that is happening. Hopefully, like Clint said, we could talk a whole hour with everything else we need to broach on. And so that's the open invitation to come back maybe once a month or so to talk about these things, because I think there's a lot of and that's my thing, right? I really don't like press releases most of the time because they really excite the public, and sometimes, for right or wrong, it's really meant for investors more than anything, but it doesn't always give, I think, people the right view of what is happening. So we have to be very careful how we portray and how we show that future out there. And like you all said, very different from what we heard from you guys at Uber Elevate in 2015 to 17 to where we are today. So thank you again for being here. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and let us know, what do you think? Is AAM ready? Are you okay flying on an electric aircraft with lots of rotors, or are you one of those 10% of business jet travelers who will not even fly on a rotary wing kind of vehicle? Thank you all for being here, and I look forward to seeing you very soon again.